No talk from E.ON is complete without the trilemma triangle, so I thought I'd start with that just to set the scene. I think because a lot of what's driving industry and us at the moment is a reduction in carbon emissions. But if we're not careful, we might take our ball off particularly the two other corners of this triangle here that we need to also satisfy, and that is a need for secure power and the need to do it at an affordable cost. And so actually a lot of what I'm going to say this morning is focusing on this security issue, because I think that's where in particular fossil plant, which I've been asked to talk about, has a role to play in the world of the future and in the world where we've reduced carbon emissions significantly, perhaps by 80% or so in the UK. I like to think about what are the threats to system security, and I've displayed them there on a diagram that is in three slices, as you can see, thinking of the demand for power, the network, and generation. But also on the timescales, because quite often when you talk to people about system security, they are thinking about a particular timescale. If you're talking to a control engineer, they will worry about the next minute or even the next second and how you keep the lights on in those timescales. But if you're talking to strategy, they're worried about where fuel is going to come from in 20 or 30 years' time. But there's a whole spectrum of timescales in between the two that we need to worry about. You can see, for instance, that some of the threats operate over years and decades, such as your assets gradually aging, or the fact that demand growth, it's an increasing stress, but it can catch you unawares if you've not planned for it. Or there might be new loads coming along which are driven by the carbon agenda, such as heat pumps and electric vehicles, that mean actually demand growth could get more significant than they're originally planned for. And so there's questions as to whether you've planned sufficient build. And we know what power plant is going to be, on the bars in 3 years, because we can see it being built. But, are we planning for the next 10 or 20 years? And are we putting the structure in place to make sure that build comes on? Moving more to the middle of the diagram, you can see there are issues that occur over months and days, like getting your weather forecast wrong. An earlier speaker said, you know exactly what the wind's doing tomorrow, and I'd say, well, you've got an idea of what the wind's doing tomorrow, but you do have to allow for forecasting errors, and the further out that you go, the bigger those errors could be, and therefore you've got to have some means of dealing with that. On the network, you've got outages of circuits, and in generation, you also have to worry about things like breakdowns, which can occur and last for hours and days, which brings us actually to the much shorter time scales that some breakdowns you get no warning of. A unit will suddenly trip, and you've got to handle that eventuality, just like part of the network might trip. Or you might come to the end of a TV program that was more popular than the grid anticipated, and you see the demand rise significantly at the end of that. I have to admit that on the day of the royal wedding, I was on an internet site that showed me what the frequency was, and I was much more interested to see how much it went up and down during the prayers and at the end of the service than actually watching the wedding itself. Sad, I'm afraid, yes.
You know how to live life.
Live life to the full, that's what I say. Right. Let's think about mitigation. How do we deal with these stresses on the left, or these sudden shocks, if you like, to the system on the right? And as you can see, there's a good number of measures that we have in our portfolio to deal with these things. So on the very long time scale, one of the reasons that we are dealing with things like CO2 emissions is so that we do maintain security over a long time scale, because climate change itself is a threat to the system. Slightly shorter time scale, we perhaps, as Parliament brings in legislation to make sure that new generation comes on, for example, or energy efficiency measures are put in place, and we're seeing that process at the moment with electricity market reform. On the network side, we can obviously strengthen the grid. Perhaps buffer batteries are an answer to some problems at some places on the grid, that local storage deals with local issues. Fuel is often quoted as a security issue, and it comes down to diversity as being one of the key ways you deal with that. Having a lot of fuel sources, even if it's all gas, having a lot of places that gas comes from, or having a complete diverse portfolio of generation technologies, so that if one of them runs into trouble for whatever reason, there are other technologies available. On the medium time scale, on the demand side, you can do things like have demand side management. And we've heard once or twice speakers mention, will thousands of fridges save you? And I'd say quite firmly, no, they won't. I think I did a back of the envelope calculation and worked out that the average load from all the fridges in the country was a few hundred megawatts, so it's not actually going to do a lot for you. But there are loads, and two in particular, that are coming on the system, for instance, electric vehicles and heat pumps, that are really quite significant loads. And because they're new loads, we've got a chance to put in systems to have some form of controllability or expose them to market prices so that they can respond themselves. On the generation side, well, price signals themselves, I've already mentioned that, but generators obviously respond to those. Sometimes over long, timescales of a year or so, if you've got a plant that's been mothballed and you see prices go up, perhaps you bring it back in response to that. Grid might issue warnings. NISM stands for Notice of Insufficient Margin, which is a formal message from the grid to say, look, there's trouble coming up. Make sure you do everything you can to get your generation ready for a particular period. Reserve and balancing are a key way to deal with the things that happen over hours and minutes, where grid are able to, or grid lets contracts to have generation plants or demand side measures that will respond within certain time scales. That could be it could be an hour, it could be a minute, to basically events that happen on the system. It might be automatic, or it might be them ringing up to get a generation ready, and then the actual enacting of that will happen in the balancing market, which happens after gate closure all the way up to real time, where there's no more time for any trading, but there's grid are accepting offers to increase or reduce generation, or increase or reduce demand. And then there's some very fast timescales, some automatic things that happen. Generators all the time are responding to frequency to keep it level. On the demand side, if the worst comes to the worst, customers or whole areas will be disconnected to keep the frequency stable. I want to just have a look at some of those things that I've talked about. So here we are at the seconds end of the timescale, and it just illustrates the effect. You can see a generator tripping off the system there. The frequency drops from its normal 50 hertz and actually bottoms out about 7 or 8 seconds later, 4 or 5 seconds later at 49.6, which is quite a significant frequency excursion. But it climbs back up again, and that's all this plant that's held in reserve, the frequency response plant coming back onto the system to an increasing output to restabilise the frequency. Now, there's a couple of particular threats here that if we go to larger generators, obviously when one trips off unexpectedly, you're going to have a bigger effect, and therefore you need to hold more reserve to counter that. I mentioned the EPR, nuclear reactor, which is 1600 megawatts, which is bigger than the current largest generator at 1100 megawatts. But actually, one of the things I think grid are starting to worry now about is not so much that, but if you lose a connection to an offshore wind farm, which can be of a similar size, that you'd need to cover that as well. So, you know, a 2 gigawatt cable goes to one of these offshore wind farms, then you've got to cover that sort of loss of load as well. So that means we need more frequency response, more reserve. And I just mentioned here inertia. The reason that frequency doesn't drop instantly to zero is because there's a lot of rotational inertia on the system. Most of that comes from the large fossil generators on the system at the moment and the large nuclear plant. Wind farms inherently have less inertia. PV inherently has no inertia, and therefore faults will propagate more quickly if you've got more of that on the system. One of the ways out of that is to put artificial inertia into the system, which you can do with in wind farms, for example. Instead of having the blades rigidly locked to the grid frequency, you can slow them down faster and take the kinetic energy out when a grid fault occurs. It means cleverer control systems, but something to think about. If we look over minutes and hours, this just shows you the sort of ups and downs that you have to deal with. This is 10-minute resolution data, and it's a simulation of what a large portfolio of wind might look like. And you can see there that the standard deviations of about 2.5% of the wind generation. I've simulated 30 gigawatts of wind, perhaps running at a third of its capacity there, using wind data that we've got on that resolution. So that's something, that's extra variation to deal with at the 10-minute time scale. Looking a bit longer, this is a simulation I did of something like 2025, and I just took data for 2000 and I can't remember what year, 7, something like that. Scaled up wind farm output that we'd got. I've got something like 35 wind farms spread across the country. Scale up the generation to represent the UK. And in this scenario, I assumed we'd got a tidal barrage as well. And you can see what happens is that you move from periods that are covered entirely by, almost entirely by non-renewable sources, flexible generation, I've called it there, to days when you've got more renewable generation than you've got demand. And therefore there's a conflict there with nuclear, and actually even if you got rid of all of nuclear, you've still got too much generation. So there's something you have to do with that. You spill it, or perhaps you can store it. But it's interesting, you wouldn't really build, the economics of building storage technology to deal with occasional events like that are not good, so you've got to find something else for the storage to do. And also interesting on that graph is just look at the pickup there from the flexible generation on that last day. You've got to find something like 20 gigawatts within 2 or 3 hours that is off to get it on the system. That's quite a mammoth task to get that much generation synchronized in that time scale. But is this, as we carry on through this, is this a role for fossil that we're talking about? Now let's look slightly along the time scale again. This is 2 weeks of data here. You can see the demand on the top line there. The peak of the year, this is 2006, occurred on February the 2nd, I think that is. And you can see what happened to the wind generation during that time. This is a classic anticyclone that everyone worries about, because anticyclones in the winter bring cold, still air, demand goes through the roof, and your wind is basically off the bars. I think generation was about 6% of capacity during that particular anticyclone. Again, that's a portfolio of onshore wind farms that we've got. The offshore had to be simulated because, as you appreciate, in 2006 there was hardly any offshore wind, so we used what we got. But we had got 4 masts dotted around the country measuring offshore wind off East Anglia in the Severn Estuary and 2 points off Scotland either side, and it was still at all those points. So you can see that even offshore would not have been generating during that time. And the question is, how do you fill that gap? That's 8 terawatt hours of missing energy to fill. There aren't many technologies that can do that. Okay, quick look at tidal. Interesting thing there is you've got a cycle over a couple of weeks to deal with, because you can go from neap tides to spring tides, and even if this is one tidal scheme, even if you have a number of tidal schemes dotted around the country, you'll get the same pattern. You might fill in the gaps of 6 hours between generations, say between an ebb flow scheme at a tidal barrage with other schemes around the country, but you'll never get rid of the spring neap cycle. So that's, if we go tidal, that's something we'll have to deal with as well. And then looking over the whole year, you can just see how days will vary from, again, this is assuming we go down the mainly wind route, from mainly being the energy coming from wind to mainly coming from some firm backup, which, as I say, is probably fossil. And therefore, what are the potential roles for fossil? You can see that there's some potential areas here. Will it be delivering bulk energy? Well, maybe, but it will need CCS. Gas will need CCS as well as coal. Can it do seasonal generation in the winter? Well, maybe you could. Maybe you could build your fossil, run it in the winter and have it summer cold, so you completely de-staff the plant in the summer. Filling anticyclone gaps, keeping for emergencies only. Well, the economics are very difficult, but something's got to be there. Maybe gas turbines are the answer there. Smoothing over these weather systems and tides. I mean, all of these things now from this point downwards are quite low load factor duties for the plant. So what you have to cost in is the fact that you're now paying this capital, which has got to regain its value over a much smaller number of hours. And certainly when I was doing some calculations earlier, I was looking at plant that's at the moment running at 30%, so it's sort of mid to low merit, will by 2020 be running like 5% of the time. So you've got to recover the capital over 15% of the time. And just finally, it's just worth thinking, what is the competition for fossil in this market? And there are other things that can do some of the duties here. So there's demand side measures, there's storage, there are interconnections which will help smooth out some of these things. And perhaps some of the newer technologies that come along, like new nuclear and new renewables, can themselves be a lot more flexible than they have been in the past. And therefore, I think the jury's out. How many companies are building, planning big fossil builds at the moment? You don't see a lot going on, and that's because of some of these issues. So I'll stop there, I think.